We are happy today to have some KUB commissioners with us, Kathy Hamilton and Ron Fonbaum and Celeste Hurley. Thank you for coming today. The October minutes were sent to you for review. Any corrections to the minutes? If not, we will consider them approved. Before we begin discussion on today's topic, I want to recognize 4 CAT members who their terms are expiring, unfortunately. This will be our last meeting with Christina, who is not here yet. I'm hoping she comes later, and Barbara Kelly, who does have a sick animal at home. She may not make it. Terry Ledford and Ty Hall. Commissioner Hamilton, I think, has a few words for you.
Yes, well, I just want to follow that. I was just going to say thank you to everyone for your service, and specifically to those of you who have been with us since the beginning. You all have given very graciously of your time to us, and I want you to know that everybody on the board appreciates that. We realize that you all are giving that time because you're looking to represent not just your interests, but the interests of the people in your community, and you help spread the message that we have. The more people that know who KUB is and what we do and how we do it, the better it is for us. And so we really do appreciate that. We always look forward to hearing your input on what the issues that we bring before you, and specifically the time that you all spent helping us with our inflation response plan that we had to put together. Your opinions and your outlook and some of the things that you've brought to us in that manner has been very important to us. And so once again, I just want to say thank you for your service. Thank you for the time that you spend with us and the time that you spend talking to the people in your community about who KUB is and what we do.
Thank you, Kathy. We also have Gabe Bolus with us today, the CEO of KUB, and I think he also has some remarks.
I'll echo Kathy a little bit and say thank you all. I've worked with you all for many years before this, and since then, I appreciate, as you know, we exist to serve our customers. That's all we exist for. And to get the input from our customers and our folks to find out what we can do better, improve on. We're always constantly trying to learn things and really appreciate the input. You know, for example, we talked about some of the new generation flexibility projects. That's the first time we've ever been allowed to generate things. And so you helped us with some of those ideas, and then we're moving forward on those as we speak. You also helped us with vegetation management. You know, that's a program that's necessary to be done, make sure we maintain reliable services, and we want to make some enhancements to it, and you all really helped get some of that rolled out. And so those are things that are just examples of things I've seen you all help us with. Those of you who are rolling off, you're still a customer of ours, so keep in touch. You can reach out to me or any of the staff. If you see things or hear things or want to give us some feedback on things, please do that. Appreciate your commitment to Kathy's board. You know, this is not an easy commitment. You have to give up 2 or 3 hours of your day every other month or every third month. And so you all came prepared, ready to talk about things and really engaged in our conversation. So thank you for that. Really appreciate your service and looking forward to seeing you all in the future. But with that, I'll turn it over to Dawn. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gabe. We do want to thank our retiring panelists for sharing insights with us over their terms, and we are really going to miss you. And in recognition of your terms of service, we do have a cake back there, so please eat cake. Everyone eats the cake. I'm also pleased to share information today about the new members who are going to be joining you. Yassine is not a new member, but he has decided that he's going to take a 3-year term, so he will still be with us. And we have 4 new members. Misty Goodwin, who's the Chief Program Officer at CAC. She'll be replacing Barbara Kelly. Laura Johns, the Senior Manufacturing Director at Dow. Brian Strutz, the restaurateur and owner of Adobo Pizza, which I think all of us love. Wes Willoughby, Director of Utilities and Energy Services at UT, who's going to be replacing Terry. You'll get their bios will be emailed to you, and they will be joining us in February, so you get a chance to meet them then. For today's topic, we have representatives from TVA with us, and they're going to share information about their integrated resource plan, which I believe they've been working on for quite a while. It's currently open for public review and comments. Since TVA is KUB's electricity supplier, we thought that you would like the opportunity to hear about the plan and to be able to meet with them and ask them questions directly. So today, joining us are Clifton Lowry, who is the Vice President of Enterprise Planning at TVA, and Amy Edge, the Director of Customer Community Relations for TVA. This is really important. Due to a prior commitment in Bristol, our presenters have to leave at 3:30 today, and that's pretty firm time. So we'll have time for everyone to ask questions, but I have to watch the clock to make sure we end on time. So I would really appreciate it if you would jot down your questions so that we can get through the entire bank of slides. Please jot down your questions, and we'll have a question and answer session at the end, okay? All right, turn it over to Clifton and Amy.
Excellent. Can you all hear me? Are we good? So thank you for having us. We are delighted to be here. We appreciate you shifting your start time to accommodate our schedule. As Dawn mentioned, I've served as a director with our customer and community relations team, and I actually served as the customer director for KUB for several years. I'm also a KUB customer, as is Clifton. So we have double down interest in what happens with KUB. So delighted to be here. We did release the draft 2025 Integrated Resource Plan on September 23rd, and we have hosted public webinars and public open houses across the valley over the last couple of months. And so tonight, Clifton and I will be headed to Bristol, Virginia to host our last IRP open house. So we're delighted to do a stop by here with you all. And so today we're going to walk through some of the draft inputs, some of the key assumptions, and then also the draft results with you all, and then open it up for your questions. So as critically important as our time is with you today, we ask that you please submit electronic comments. Our comment period is open through next Wednesday, so through December 11th. And those comments are critically important to us. Public involvement, stakeholder engagement, huge part of our IRP process. So we're going to ask that you submit official comments as well. And so I think with that, we may go ahead and dive in, Clifton, yeah?
Yeah, sounds good.
And Clifton will handle the majority of the presentation, giving his expertise in the modeling component of it. My role here today is really more around the stakeholder involvement and public input dynamic. And I would be remiss, if you don't mind, Clifton, there's a couple of things I would say. Aaron has served as the chair of one of our FACAs, our Federal Advisory Committees, on the Regional Energy Resource Council, which has played a big role at advising our board in various topics, including the IRP. And then there's several friends here that are on the community advisory panel. Stephen and I have several engagements, and then on a personal note, Kira as well. So good to be with you all today. Clifton, all you.
Sounds good. So I'll echo the appreciation just for opportunity to be here, speak to you all about this. You know, Amy said it well. I might characterize it as KUB has powered my life for over 40 years. So date myself a little
Dang
bit
it, I
here.
needed to say that. That was good.
But yeah, I was born in Knoxville, raised in Knoxville, went just a little ways down the road for college to Carson Newman. So this is home. There's no question. And this is, you know, a really, really important activity that we're doing, TVA is doing. But I can't say enough to express appreciation for what you all are doing to support KUB here in the Knoxville area. It means a lot to me personally, just being from here, growing up here, living here. But, you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't say at the onset that the 3 E's of TVA, what we're here to do, energy, environmental stewardship, supporting economic development, you know, this is who we are. It's in our DNA. And when we talk about an integrated resource plan, which is essentially a long-term study of how we meet electric demand in the future, these elements are going to come through in how we've thought about structuring the analysis itself. And so just starting there, give a little bit of context to what an IRP is. And I mentioned this before, but it's a long-term study of what do we anticipate the electric demand of the future to look like, based on some different drivers, right? We can see changes in regulation, we can see changes in customer behavior, we can see technology breakthroughs, we can see changes in resource costs, commodity prices. All of these things will happen. And so we're trying to study what effects those happenings will have on future electric demand. And so it's a long-term study. Traditionally, IRPs are a 20-year study. Our last IRP, the 2019 IRP, took us through 2038. But this one, we took a little further. Just that TVA has made some aspirational statements around mid-century mark, and the nation as a whole has made some aspirational statements around, you know, targets or aspirations for the mid-century mark. We're taking this IRP out to 2050, and so 25 plus years essentially is the horizon here, and there can be a lot of uncertainty across that long time horizon. We'll kind of talk about how we account for that. The IRP is the resource plan, so what resources do you match to meet the electric demand that shows up in these futures that you study? But it's also a study of the environmental implications of those resource plans. And so we also do an accompanying environmental impact statement. The IRP is a programmatic study. We're not making site-specific decisions, but we do need to understand what are the impacts to air and land and water quality that could manifest as you think about the different resource combinations that play out in the future. So there's really two parts to the IRP, the resource plan and the environmental impact statement. The role that this plays for us is that TVA is statutorily mandated to implement a least cost planning program. And so as part of that, you have to have something that serves as the foundation for creating an asset strategy and future decision-making under that asset strategy. And that's what the IRP does. It again, doesn't make site-specific decisions. It's broad. Its sort of aperture is the 7-state region, kind of TVA proper wide. It informs our financial planning assumptions, so it doesn't dictate rate actions, it doesn't dictate rate changes, it does not dictate how we would use debt to fund new assets or how we would engage with LPC partners like KUB to facilitate the implementation of future resource plans, but it does serve as the basis to create those conversations and have those discussions. And then ultimately, there's a couple of things that it doesn't do. I talked about rate changes. It's also not a distribution level resource plan. We're not getting down to the level of, what happens in the KUB footprint specifically. That comes as a follow-on, and there's some other efforts that TVA has going on that'll complement this one as we move forward. I mentioned this. We're statutorily mandated to implement a least cost planning program. This is from the Energy Policy Act of '92 and was set up by the TVA Act itself. Least cost planning involves 6 key principles. So cost being one of those, but also how risk informed are our planning assumptions? How much risk exists in a given assumption of a resource cost or a commodity price forecast? You have to think about those factors. What are the environmental implications of the future resource portfolios that we may put together? And then from an operational perspective, how reliable, resilient, diverse, flexible is the system we put together such that it can maintain high reliability, but also be responsive through extreme events that may test the system at times. So we think about these 6 things, and when we get to the results, I'll sort of call back to these with what you see in terms of the performance of the different portfolios. So perhaps just a little bit of context to how we got to this point. Amy said it well, released the draft IRP back at the end of September, and we're in the comment period now. But this process has been going on for quite some time. We really started it back at the end of 2022, just getting prepared to do the work itself. We then arrived at the spring of 23 and issued a public scoping opportunity, so our notice of intent to tell the world that we are doing an IRP, that the 2019 IRP is kind of running its course and it's time to have a new one in place to facilitate our future direction. And so you collect input from the public through that process. It's what do you want to see, what do you not want to see, and that helps shape how we think about doing the analysis. We have an IRP working group, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like and the role they play. But that's what helps us design the architecture, the framing of the IRP analysis. So what futures could we find ourselves in? How will we meet the demand in those futures? These are scenarios and strategies. And that's how we drove to this point of doing that analysis, turning all these words into data and assumptions, and then modeling output to get to future portfolios that you can then evaluate. From here, we're driving really to take the final IRP to the TVA board for their consideration in the May timeframe of next year, so at the May 2025 board meeting. To do that, we have to publish the final IRP at the end of March, because there's a 30-day cooling off period that has to occur before we can take it to the TVA board. And so we've essentially got about 3 to 4 months here to collect the input from the comment period, refine any analysis that needs to be done in the IRP, so this is sensitivity analysis, refine any of the words and the characterization of the results in the document itself, and then finalize that and work with the RERC and Aaron and their group to kind of advise the TVA board on did this effort meet the objective. And so that'll be happening really over the next 3 to 4 months, as I said. I've got a slide on stakeholders, interaction, engagement, a really important element of this. I'm going to actually let Amy cover this because this is really right in her wheelhouse. So,
Yeah, and so we've alluded to it, the fact that public involvement and stakeholder engagement is a really critical component for TVA when we think about the integrated resource planning process, because it's for the people that we serve that we do this work. And so noted here on this chart are just a couple of the examples of how we've involved various groups, stakeholder sectors along the way. There's a few that I would call out here. We mentioned the public scoping period, which happens at the onset of the IRP process, where we open it up for comments, for folks to share their thoughts on what they'd like to see. But even prior to that, we had a diverse group of stakeholders that got together, called the Utility of the Future Information Exchange, that actually provided some recommendations for the Integrated Resource Plan Working Group to consider right out of the gate. So that was a terrific opportunity for us. The IRP Working Group, so that's a diverse group of 24 stakeholders. We've got a few of Gabe's peers in that group. Local power companies are represented, direct served, some academia, some environmentalist friends that have worked with us intimately every month for the last 18 months. That's a group that's helped us with the modeling, with what will be the sensitivities. They've been a really integral part of what we've been doing. And then the Federal Advisory Group, so the Regional Energy Resource Council, again, we can't say enough about that group. It's a public meeting. Diverse group of stakeholders make up that council, and they provide advice statements to the TVA board, so a big part of what we listen to. And then our regional engagement. So similarly to what we're doing today, we've done across the valley. And I will give a shout out to KUB that not many of our local power companies have taken the step to have community advisory panels, so this is terrific. But we have also engaged with some civic organizations and the like, so across the valley. And then, of course, right now we're in the public review period, the open comment period. So the comments that come into us, again, from September 23rd through next week, those are really going to help to shape additional sensitivities that we may do over the next couple of months, so critically important to us. But yeah, just a graphic of some of the engagements we've had. And again, we're delighted to be here today.
yeah, really well said. And it sets up this conversation of walking the working group through how we do power supply planning, really on a semi-annual basis. We're really doing this work all the time at TVA. This is the piece that we really open things up, bring stakeholders in, get challenged, get feedback, watch them challenge each other in these groups, and it's a fun interaction to sit back and see play out. But this is really the mechanic that we're trying to execute. So scenarios, worlds that we find ourselves in the future, that we vary the electric demand given different factors that I mentioned before. Strategies are putting together different resource focus areas from the selection of resource options. So solar, wind, storage, gas, energy efficiency, demand response, all the different resources that are available for selection, but using strategies to promote different ones, doing the modeling work and building the modeling assumptions of resource costs and characteristics and load shape and all these things to get portfolios. And then you get these portfolios out of the modeling exercise and you look at the risk. So you start varying some of the assumptions in sensitivity analysis to understand how susceptible is one portfolio versus another to the key factors that might impact it in the future. So say a natural gas price forecast, for example. And then ultimately you put all of the portfolios back against a set of metrics aligned to our least cost planning principles to understand where are the no regrets, low regrets actions that TVA needs to be taking really over the next 10 years to continue to fulfill our mission and set us up well to continue to do that mission effectively or fulfill that mission effectively even all the way out to 2050. This slide gives you an illustration of the kind of the equation that we're trying to balance. So this is the role of a resource planner at any utility, but at TVA as well. So the graph that you're seeing here, again, illustrative, but the blue bars are the existing supply that you have today. So you have resources that are powering the needs of the region, and over time, those existing resources either reach a contract expiration or they have to be retired because they get to the end of their useful life. So that blue bar goes down, right? Your existing resources get get less as you move forward into the future. The lines represent different load forecasts. What's the demand of the future going to be? It could be, a very sort of moderate growth. It could be something a little greater. It could be something quite extreme. And so the space that's created in between those blue bars and the individual lines, that is the purpose and need of the integrated resource plan. How could we fill that need in the future with different combinations of resources to continue to deliver on our commitments as an agency? A lot of words on this slide, and so I'll sort of step through each of the scenarios and strategies to set up the results that we'll look at in a minute. But we look at 6 scenarios in this integrated resource plan. We actually started with 5, but the EPA threw a little curveball at us between issuing their draft greenhouse gas rules and their final rule. And so we added a 6th at the tail end of this process. But I'll really start with the first 3. So scenario 1 is our expectations of the economic backdrop and how it will change, how that affects loads, what technology costs exist, what commodity prices are in order to create our baseline expectation of demand without any additional regulation that's beyond what's already in place today. We then put some bounding cases around that. So what if the macroeconomic backdrop is better and that facilitates more productivity, more need for electricity, more demand growth? What if the macroeconomic backdrop is worse, in which that would stifle the demand growth that we see on the system? And so these are the higher growth economy, stagnant economy scenarios. Now, I mentioned the EPA's draft greenhouse gas rules. We had 2 scenarios that were built using those, so scenarios 4 and 5. And we really wanted to understand what would it look like to get the TVA system to net zero from a carbon emissions perspective by 2050. And so the draft greenhouse gas rules would push us that direction to a degree, but we also included a carbon tax. So starting in the mid-30s, what if there is future regulation that serves to create a cost to carbon emissions? What are the implications of that from a utility planning perspective to a load growth perspective? And so that's scenario 4. Scenario 5 takes that same framework, but then assumes you see some technology breakthroughs with clean energy resources such that it facilitates economy-wide transition to a no-carbon world, such that you are electrifying everything. So think of this as the highest demand growth scenario that we looked at, and it effectively doubles the demand that we see on the system today by 2050. For context, generally speaking, this time of the year, moving into January, the peak demand we see is around 31,000 megawatts. It can go higher if temperatures get colder, but that's weather normal, that's what you'd expect to see. In scenario 5, that number is north of 60,000 megawatts of demand on the system. So this is almost all vehicles are EVs. Industrial electrification is prominent. Load growth has been significantly amplified through technology breakthrough. And then the last scenario, scenario 6, is the same reference case that we started with, but implementing the EPA's final greenhouse gas rule. And there was one key difference really between the draft rule and the final rule, which was the final rule did not address regulation on existing natural gas resources. It only addressed new natural gas resources that would come onto the system in the future. And so that was important for us to reflect that final rule. On the strategy side, we have 5 strategies, and so they're alphabetical in this sense. And so strategy A is just baseline utility planning following our least cost planning principles. What are the resources that are available for selection? What are their expectations of cost? When you move down beyond strategy A into B, C, D, and E, we use a promotion mechanic to get different types of resources into the analysis. And so a promotion mechanic basically means you force the model to pick some volume of these resources, or you lower the price such that the model wants to pick these lower cost resources. And so in the carbon-free innovation focus, the promoted technologies are advanced nuclear, carbon capture and sequestration technology. In the carbon-free commercial ready focus, it's wind, solar, and storage that gets promoted. In the distributed and demand side focus, this is on the demand side of the equation, energy efficiency programs, demand response programs, distributed resources, such that you get virtual power plants more prominently delivered on the system. And then a resiliency focus, which was an IRP working group add through the process. We really were kind of focused on the first four, but they wanted to understand what happens if you assume there's strategic transmission investment and distribution level transmission investment that creates more opportunity for distributed resources and smaller resources, such that you end up with a less centralized, more resilient system. So for context, some of our largest power generating units today are over 1,000 megawatts. And if you lose one of those units, right, that is a significant concentration risk, a significant loss. If you go with a resiliency focus, you get smaller units, more distributed. You end up with a little bit different reliability profile. It was important for the working group to kind of push that analysis through this effort. And so when you put these things together, 6 scenarios and 5 strategies, you get 30 core portfolios, and there's a naming convention on here just to kind of help with the numerical values and then the alphabetical strategies nested within those scenarios to say these are the 30 core portfolios, and then we do risk analysis around those. I've talked a little bit about the resources, so these are the resources that are available for selection. The color coding at the top will become important when we get to some of the graphs and charts, but there's a theme here in terms of these broader categories of resources across the top, and then the specific ones that were available for selection for the model. All resources have to be available for selection if they are proven viable. We can't discriminate against one resource. That's actually part of what the Energy Policy Act of '92 outlines for us. And so from a nuclear perspective, 3 different options: an advanced pressurized water reactor. So this is an AP1000, like what Southern Company just put online at their plant Bogle, 2 of those units. We have light water and Gen 4 small modular reactors, so the type of nuclear technology that TVA is exploring for Clinch River just outside of Oak Ridge. With the hydro system, building a new dam today would be an interesting undertaking, maybe leave it at that. But we do have the potential to get more capability out of the existing assets. So we have a hydro uprate option that the model can select, 2 different coal options, essentially controlled or uncontrolled from a carbon capture perspective, a number of different gas options, so both peaking gas as well as combined cycle gas that runs more frequently, both with and without carbon capture and sequestration technology, more efficient aeroderivative combustion turbine technology, reciprocating engine technology with gas, hydrogen blending, so an alternative fuel option, as well as a combined heat and power. So think of that as kind of a distributed gas resource option. In the renewable space, so 2 different types of wind, utility scale, so think tracking systems like what's right over here off of I-40, versus distributed solar, more kind of rooftop scale is what you'd think in mind with that one. 3 different wind options, so imported wind from the Midwest, local, generally speaking, local southeast high hub height wind, so this is where along the Mississippi River, if you go higher than the traditional turbine height so that you can get broader wind turbine blades, you can achieve more economic wind potential really along the western half of the service territory of TVA. And then a high voltage direct current option also out of the Midwest, which is a specific option that we have received offers for in the past through some of our carbon-free RFP work. On the storage side, pump storage, so we have a pump storage facility today outside of Chattanooga, the Raccoon Mountain Hydro Pump Storage Facility. We're exploring the potential for perhaps doing another pump storage facility in that general same area, and so have that available for selection. 4-hour lithium-ion battery, an advanced chemistry, longer duration battery, and then distributed storage as well. And then lastly, all the way on the right side of the page, demand-side programs, so energy efficiency and demand response. 2 things listed here, but know that below the hood of those, there's actually numerous different measures that the model has for selection. So think commercial lighting programs, residential insulation programs, things that when you get a signal of that out of an IRP, that's where you go have conversations with the local power company customers on how do we partner to deliver that all the way down to the end-use customer. Okay, so now I'm going to go through results. That's kind of a lot of setup. This is what I affectionately refer to as the quilt chart. So the quilt chart is the different types of resources and the ranges of additions of those resources that you can see through time. And then you essentially take these elements and where you see the strongest signals from all of the different portfolios, you weave that together beyond the IRP into an asset strategy. And so this is a by 2035 view. And I mentioned before that we're operating under the 2019 IRP today, and it's serving us well. We are seeing a lot of evolution in some of the assumptions that were in place when the 2019 IRP was finalized, right? Regulations, cost of resources through changes in incentives, just overall system demand has evolved. And so when you think about the important aspect of an IRP study period, that front 10 years are the things that you do now to continue to meet what your outcome objectives are in 10 years from now, essentially low cost, highly reliable, increasingly cleaner, increasingly resilient. But it also has to set you up well for the long term. And so I'm focusing on 2035 here, but no, we also have this sort of look all the way out to 2050, and the numbers get bigger, as you can imagine, with load growth potential and things of that nature through the scenarios. But I'll start at the top left. Note that we need 9 to 26 gigawatts of new capacity added to the system by 2035. So on the front end, in the stagnant growth economy scenario, we see loads as essentially being flat through the study period. And so what that 9 tells you is we have at least 9, roughly 10 gigawatts of resources that are going to retire or are going to reach a contract expiration that have to be replaced. We cannot let those retire without replacement. Up to the higher end, where you're in the high growth economy or the scenario 5, the carbon regulation with high growth, we could have a need for up to 26 gigawatts of new capacity on the system. For context, we have about 40,000 megawatts, 40 gigawatts on the system today. So adding 26 at the same time that you've got about 9 going away is a significant undertaking. As you walk from left to right along the top, the theme here is relatively consistent with what we saw in the analysis in the 2019 IRP. We continue to see a strong signal for solar to come onto the system to provide economic energy hours. Solar has to be balanced with a firm dispatchable technology like gas, like demand response, like storage. And so this sort of four-pronged approach, if you will, of solar with gas, with storage, with complementary energy efficiency and demand response programs, you really see that kind of come through, similar to what we saw in the 2019 IRP. Why do you have to firm up some of your intermittent resources like solar? Well, solar is excellent for energy hours. It's excellent for meeting our summer peak when it's 5 in the afternoon in late July, late August. Everyone's coming home. It's really hot. Air conditions are going. The solar contributes very well to meeting that peak. In the winter, when it's 5 a.m. on a January 3rd morning, we're not getting any solar generation really. So you have to have some sort of technology that backs up the intermittency of either the solar or the wind, gives you the ability to have flexibility around meeting that winter peak, but also ramping up and down as a winter day goes along and the sun does come up and the solar cart's contributing, you're bringing other resources off. And that's kind of how this complementary nature plays out. All resources have advantages. They also have shortcomings that our modeling has to account for. And so these are the ranges: 3 to 20 gigawatts of solar by 2035. That's a nameplate. 4 to 19 gigawatts of gas, either through traditional natural gas firing, alternative fuel firing, or with carbon capture and sequestration technology. 1 to 4 gigawatts of energy efficiency and demand response additions. We're actually on track with that one already with some of the actions from the 2019 IRP. Have just recently announced $1.5 billion of investment in new demand-side programs, working with LPC partners to deliver that energy savings and ultimately demand reduction potential. Up to 6 gigawatts of storage as I move down to the bottom left corner of the chart, and then moving right, up to 4 gigawatts of wind, up to 1 gigawatt of nuclear, And with the nuclear, that timeline by 2035 is admittedly perhaps a little aggressive, but the work that we have done with prepping the Clinch River site, having an early site permit, facilitates that option. And then nuclear becomes a much more prominent player when you look out beyond 2035 into the future and you think about the long lead time of putting that type of a technology through the permitting process, through the construction process, and then commissioning it onto the system. And in the bottom right corner, all of the portfolios, all 30 that I mentioned before, deliver better carbon intensity than we see today. So our current position is roughly about 50% carbon intensity reduction. So this is mass carbon CO2 emissions divided by the megawatt hours produced. Roughly a 50% reduction today from a 2005 baseline. And when you look out to 2035, we see that improving to a 75% reduction, up to a 90% reduction in some of the more focused strategies that promote the carbon-free technologies, as well as the scenarios where you see regulation on carbon. The next slide, I think you all have these materials. I have covered all of these points really already in what I said, but I do want to come back to the concept of firm dispatchable technology. This one is very important to understand. It's very important for us to consider as a utility given our dual peaking nature and given the geographic diversity of our system. We have a very wide system. And so having resources that are flexible, as temperatures change and move across our service territory from the west side all the way to the east side and vice versa, it's really, really important to have technologies that are flexible and that we have control over. These next two are going to be eye charts. You have these in your materials and the packets that are in front of you, so I'll just more orient you to what you see. And please consume these as you see fit, and let me know if you have questions when we get to that point of the discussion. But on the left, this is the incremental capacity from the modeling results by 2035. And then on the right, 2050. I mentioned before that the coloring of the different resource or technology types would be important from a few slides. This is where you see that coloring continue to come through. And you've got the groupings of all 30 portfolios really by scenario first, then with the various strategies within that scenario. And so I'll give you a couple of examples just to kind of follow along. So does that work? Yep. So in the scenario where we have the most growth on the system, and when you look at the potential for some of the strategies to push in different technology types, this is where you see your nuclear resources perhaps playing a more prominent role in the future. Really, among all these, back to my point from a couple of slides ago, you continue to see meaningful amounts of solar coming on the system, meaningful amounts of dispatchable technologies, so gas, storage, energy efficiency and demand response programs, all showing up quite prominently. And then you do have in these sort of regulation portfolios in particular, in the regulation scenarios, you do see where alternative fuels like hydrogen firing at gas plants or carbon capture and sequestration show up more prominently as those technologies have a higher cost, but in a regulatory environment tend to play very well. When you take the additions, those are essentially cumulative by those years, and then you can look at what is the energy needed to serve the demand specifically in 2035 and 2050 with the combination of the additions as well as the existing portfolio that we have today. And so nuclear, you see a lot more green here because you have the existing nuclear fleet continuing to operate and serve the needs of the valley. So there are roughly 8,000 megawatts of nuclear capability. I do want to point out that you don't see in the additions and as well in the energy by 2035, you don't see any coal. TVA's baseline planning assumption for all of this analysis is that the balance of our coal fleet will be retired by 2035 and thus will not be running in 2035. And you don't see any additional coal selected by the modeling. This is where I mentioned before that you see a doubling of the demand on the system. Now, this is on an energy terawatt hour basis. Today's demand is in the kind of 175-ish terawatt hours per year. And so when you look at the highest growth case that we have by 2050, we've effectively doubled that demand with the considerations and assumptions around that portfolio, or excuse me, around that scenario. So how do you evaluate these, right? Lots of resources, lots of combinations. Here's how they run, but how do they actually perform across those principles that I spoke to before of low cost, risk informed, environmental stewardship, and operability? And so this infographic is a good, better, best sort of characterization that helps you understand trade-offs of the different strategies. This is an important time to say that the outcome of the IRP is not to identify one strategy to pursue. It's to understand which strategies perform the best across a variety of futures, get into the reasons why those strategies perform the best, and then put together that one strategy that sort of pulls the best attributes from this analysis together into one asset strategy and execution path. And so when you think about trade-offs, cost versus environmental impact versus risk. So let's look at the baseline utility planning strategy at the top. The lowest cost portfolio, and there's 3 different cost metrics that sit behind this, but depicted as the kind of the compilation of those 3 together. It's the lowest cost. It has the best cost performance, but it performs less well from an environmental impact perspective. Juxtapose that with your carbon-free innovation focus, your carbon-free commercial-ready focus. They are the best performers in the environmental space, but they have a trade-off to them. That costs more money. From a risk perspective, you see these two strategies performing the best because they rely less on commodities, on natural gas, coal, things of that nature that have volatility to them and could have supply disruptions. And then I'll point to the end column. This is a testament to the work that goes in on the front end, from the working group to my team that does all this work, that we have 30 portfolios that we feel could actually work on the system, right? This is not just a think tank exercise. This has to be infused with reality and the operational considerations of the needs of this part of the country. And so all of these perform very well from a reliability perspective, portfolio diversity, and portfolio flexibility. You get my last slide, you get the same sort of context that needs to be considered when you expand the environmental metrics that live in the resource plan that are really much more focused on carbon emissions, water use, waste intensity, land use and land intensity, and you build upon that in the environmental impact statement. So continuing to characterize the potential trade-offs between portfolios. So where we were back here with 2 portfolios or 2 strategies that perform very well in the environmental impact perspective, teasing that out further in the environmental impact statement, you would see trade-offs of your carbon-free innovation-focused strategy requires much more water because of the types of technologies that show up there, the nuclear technologies in particular, relative to your carbon-free commercial ready. Your carbon-free commercial ready strategy requires much more land because it's focused on solar and wind resources and storage resources. And so that characterization shows up in the EIS, as does social considerations like the socioeconomics and environmental justice that will be really important to thoroughly consider and discuss and evaluate when you get to site-specific decision-making. But we tee up that concept really as feedback from the RERC and that team that we need to be very thorough in speaking to how we would consider that when we do get to specific decisions. And so with that, I'll pause. That was a whole lot. And see what questions that you all may have. And I'm happy to go back to slides if helpful. So
the EIS is for 50 years?
to 2050, so about 26 years in total.
Okay, so what are some of the metrics that you guys are using to even come up with how you're looking at the environment?
Yeah,
And
so
I'm talking
this,
about, and right now, we're in the middle of all these housing complexes and things coming up, and the electric cars and that. How does that factor into this equation?
it does. It focuses on the resources themselves. So what types of resources are you adding? And what are their impacts to air quality based on greenhouse gas emissions if they are an emitting resource? Or what are their impacts to water if they have to pull from water resources in order to use it for cooling? For example, nuclear plants need that. What are the impacts in terms of waste production? And so when you get resources like coal, for example, that has coal combustion residuals, you have a waste impact that shows up with that. So those are the types of things that are considered in the EIS and flow through into the IRP document as well. We look very specifically at land use, greenhouse gas emissions as well. Something that is unique in our IRP that we partnered with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to include, NREL, is a life cycle greenhouse gas analysis for every portfolio. So this is not just about what gets emitted during operation. It's also about the emissions that occur when you mine, construct, and do maintenance on these different types of resources, plants or programs. What happens then when you deconstruct them? They reach the end of their useful life. So that emission profile is considered as well. And it's put against a social cost framework. So not just the total emissions, but what would be the social cost impact of those emissions based on the type of greenhouse gas that it emits. So not just carbon, but mercury, SO2s, things of that nature as well.
So your more traditional forms of energy, of course, natural gas, et cetera, when you're looking at electric, nuclear, and solar, what are some of the downside things that you're looking at that we have not discovered or uncovered? And what are the impacts that you have discovered on the impact because of the environment? Because I'm looking at the electric, and just from a layman's point of view, electricity everybody can't handle. And then the nuclear, and we already know about Chernobyl. And so what are the risk factors associated with this new energy that we're looking at, including the solar? I know how that is in Europe. All of their good land is just full of wind tunnels and everything. So how are you all addressing that as far as really increasing the power grid?
Yeah, it's really specific to those resources that would show up. So in the scenarios where you're assuming significant growth, right, let's use electric vehicles as an example. You're transferring an emission risk, right? You have internal combustion engines, ICE vehicles that run on gasoline today. If you move that to EVs, now you've transferred how that emission profile may show up. It's no longer in the transportation sector, it's in the utility sector, and it shows up in this type of analysis, right? It's what combinations of resources are you putting together to serve the demand created from those EVs, as an example. So is it nuclear? Is it solar? Is it natural gas? Is it storage resources? And then what do those do from an environmental perspective? So we catch it that way. I think you're also asking around, well, what's the kind of the risk of building nuclear from a, call it 3 Mile Island, from a Chernobyl perspective?
Exactly.
It's an externality to this work. I think we're essentially counting on the fact that the costs associated with nuclear resources, which are quite high on a relative basis, reflect the fact that there is significant involvement from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to permit and get a license to operate these.
What is the pushback, and this is my final question, that you are anticipating or that you already have with the fossil fuel giants of the world? Because could that be a potential game breaker or what have you? How are you all addressing that? And then compensating those jobs with people who have been on those oil rigs for years. How are we going to do that? Yeah,
we had some conversation around kind of, does each portfolio create its own sort of economic development effect? And in the 2019 IRP, we did a little bit of that analysis, but you can only go kind of to the step of how many jobs are required to run a nuclear unit, right, versus not very many for a solar farm. And you did see some of those differences, but sort of getting to what you're talking about, the bigger implications of it from a socioeconomic perspective, we don't really step into that in the IRP much beyond maybe the fact that when you think about the way we've assumed I'll call it the emerging technologies playing in, so hydrogen as an example, we have assumed that we aren't creating that hydrogen, that there is a market that is creating hydrogen at a certain dollar per kilogram cost. And so you could take that as signals of like, if that market were to be created and play out, right, these perhaps are new jobs that get created.
Right.
That is an opportunity. And so not something we address in the IRP, but potentially types of things that a national energy policy perhaps could get behind and drive to.
Okay, thank you.
Good questions. I appreciate those.
A question, it's sort of multi-layered, but can you provide a little bit, first of all, a little bit of historical perspective in that, you know, we're currently functioning from the 2019 IRP, which was just 5 years ago, yet this one is looking at a short-term 10-year and a longer-term 26-year. When was the last IRP done prior to 2019? And then what type of significant evolutions happened that were that were unanticipated, that forced, you know, an update? Because you're saying from 2019 there were some benchmarks that you know, now has precipitated, you know, sort of refocusing and looking forward with some of the, you know, changes that have taken place. So I'd like to kind of get a clearer picture from what happened before 2019, what were some of the major catalysts that have happened since then to now in such a short period of time, 5 years. I feel like that's a pretty short period of time to now necessitate sort of redoing the IRP, but looking so far into the future when things are happening so quickly.
Yeah, fantastic question. Lots of pieces to that one, so I may do a little bit of a walk here.
Sure.
So let's walk back. So we're 2025 IRP once this is done. 2019, prior to that was the 2015 IRP. Prior to that was the 2011 IRP. So we've kind of been on this 4 or 5 year cadence. Let me use 2011 as a good starting point because that was coming out of really the global financial crisis, right? 2008 crash, 2009, 10, 11 recovery. You had that as the real overhang of like, how impactful and sustained is that going to be? Because that was significantly impactful to this part of the country. The whole country was impacted, the whole world was impacted, but our region in particular saw significant collapse of demand. That's about the same time that the United States Enrichment Corporation, our uranium enricher that was up in Paducah, had given TVA the signal like, hey, the demand's just not there sort of globally. We're kind of refocusing. And that was essentially a customer the size of KUB, Electric Power Board, Chattanooga, Nashville, a big load that still operates to some degree today, but not near the volume. And so you kind of saw this theme of this macroeconomic drag that when you did the analysis in the IRP, you didn't see significant ranges of growth. You saw pretty steady growth ranges. You move forward to the 2015 IRP, a little bit similar story, but this is where we're into the what I would call the naturally occurring energy efficiency and demand response. So a lot of codes and standards on HVACs, appliances, things of that nature had not been touched for some time, and administrations at that point were pushing for better codes and standards on appliance use, HVAC units, things of that nature. And so while we saw growth on our system, it was offset by this naturally occurring energy efficiency stuff. And so we refer to it really as a decade of flat load growth. From about 2012 through about 2020, we were pretty much steady along. And so the IRP that happened in 2015, sort of its hallmark was programmatic demand-side programs. So these naturally occurring things are happening. What else could TVA and LPC partners do? And so that was a little bit of the technology innovation that showed up there. And then you get into the 2019 IRP, and this is where you had a lot of improvements in newer technology resource costs. So solar, storage, wind, starting to see the conversation around nuclear getting a little bit of legs. And you saw a better signal for those resources for the future because we were seeing on a real basis, non-inflationary basis, costs for those resources coming down over time. And so when you forecast that out, you see that potential. And then I think what differentiates this IRP is we essentially hit 2020, you get the global pandemic, and we experienced quite a bit of demand reduction as that played out, but it very quickly came back, and it came back very strong. I sort of characterize it as a little bit of an accordion. You kind of pin up some demand for a period of time, and then the overall economic backdrop was such that all this future demand that was going to be happening came flying forward, and we see a lot of load growth on our system because of how well we had done from a financial perspective with our rates, with our reliability. And so you get to this IRP, the things that have changed the most are regulations, incentives for resources, so the IRA, the IIJA, things of that nature. You're seeing a different level of involvement with customers. Customers are very interested in how their power is made and what sort of environmental impacts come with that. And so I think as you think through the fact that we're doing these IRPs every 4 or 5 years, it really is the right thing to do to refresh your assumptions on that type of a cadence from a very public stakeholder involved perspective. But we are doing that work actually 2 times per year. We produce new power supply plans that go out 20 years in the fall and the spring each calendar year. And so I hope that context is helpful and maybe starts to get at some of where you were going with the kind of understanding of what has changed and what drove different considerations in different IRPs.
Yeah, it definitely does. So then do you anticipate ahead of, 2035, 2050? I mean, I presume refreshing this
Yeah.
with the same frequency?
Can I just add to
Sure.
that? Coming out of the Kingston coal ash spill, when we were having dialogues with this EPW at the Senate, TVA committed to the EPW that they would have a public IRP approximately on a 5-year cadence.
Okay.
So that is not just like we just happen to be doing it. That is an agreement that is understood with the Oversight Committee at the U.S. Senate, that they will have a public IRP. Because for a long time, they didn't have one. And then in the 1992 Energy Policy Act, when we got it through, and the first IRP was in 1995, there was a gap from 95 until 2011, where they'd never had a public IRP. They were doing the internal stuff. Mm-hmm. A lot of us were asking for them to do publicly, and they didn't. So after the Kingston coal ash spill, when there was a sort of a coming to Jesus moment with the Oversight Committee, there was that commitment made, which was the right thing to do, and that's the cadence that they're on now. So you should anticipate there'd be one going forward approximately every 5 years.
Yep, that's right. And usually when we take this to the board, I talked a lot about the portfolios and the resource addition sort of strategic direction. There's also signposts that the board will say, you need to monitor these things. And we work with the working group to say, these are the critical things, right? Resource costs, customer expectations, demand, commodity prices. Like, you need to have this is the range that you studied, and where are you in that range kind of as you go forward and execute under the IRP to know that have you reached that point in time that it's time to do a new one. And the board, in the 2019 IRP, that TVA board directed staff to initiate the next IRP no later than 2024. And so we were kind of at that point. We knew in 2022, into 22, that this was coming and that the signals were there. So that's kind of how this will play out, I think, beyond the 2025 IRP.
And so that's definitely helpful. And then just looking at, in that things, as I say, seem to be evolving so quickly and significantly, and forecasting, obviously, and long-term strategic planning is
We're gonna be wrong.
obviously important.
It's just a
But,
question of how
you do,
much.
you question the relevancy in
Yeah.
10 years and 25 years, and so, that
Yeah.
just is why that sort of I raised that question.
Yeah, no, it's excellent observation, excellent point that, focusing on 35, I won't say there's not uncertainty, but it's significantly narrower than the uncertainty that lives beyond 35 out to 2050. So I think the role an IRP plays, the most important role that it plays is, yes, you need a long-term view, because you can't be making nearsighted decisions, right? That doesn't work. But the decisions that you are making today are most impactful for kind of this 10-year ahead period, and then setting you up for those future decisions that will come after that.
Are there any questions from any other panel members? Stephen?
Yeah, so I want to explore something, and I'll do a quick little thought exercise. So I'm going to build a facility in my backyard, and I'm going to put a big screen that flashes memes up on the thing, and it's going to use, let's say 2,000 megawatts of power to just have my
That's a big
backyard
screen.
with this really bright screen
Yeah.
just going, and don't really have any employees much at all. I have the backing of a billionaire, and I'm just gonna run the hell out of the juice from the system, and you guys are obligated to serve me, right? And so you've got to go build generation capacity, you got to build substations, you got to do all this. But, the social contract for monopoly utility has largely been that you're going to serve large load like that because it has ancillary benefits to society.
Mm-hmm.
My meme machine doesn't have a lot. And so if you look at not only TVA, but we were looking at Georgia Power's IRP, they're now talking about 2x on their system demand of about 16 gigawatts, up over 30 gigawatts in the foreseeable, less than 10 years kind of planning horizon. Most of that is coming from digital demand, cryptocurrency, AI. Hardly anybody's employed in cryptocurrency. It's a get-rich-quick scheme. It's y'all's largest customer, I think, industrial customer on the KUB load. Hardly anybody's employed by it, but you're scrambling to build infrastructure to support it. I mentioned y'all, just so everybody else knows, one of the other LPCs in the TVA system, Memphis Light, Gas, and Water, our friend Elon Musk has announced the XAI. They're going to drop a giant server farm in Memphis. 150 megawatts was the initial load announcement. Yesterday, they 10x'd it, said they're going 10x. Okay, now that's 10x in the computing capability, but it will likely mean that they're going to go from 150 megawatts to over a gigawatt, close to 1,500. That's larger than TVA's largest single unit plant, so it's likely 2 plants. They're going to draw in some other things, but it's not going to be a huge employer. AI is a bit speculative at this moment. And so my point is, at what point do you begin to start to rein in me like my meme machine, or me like my cryptocurrency, or me like a billionaire who's coming in to take advantage of public resources and forcing the whole system to twist around on a speculative play on AI to create a Grok, which is what this is going to feed. XAI is basically doing the Chat GPT version on what used to be Twitter X, called Grok, of AI, right? And most of it's BS memes and all this other kind of stuff that's being, people generating, flying pigs with, stuff like this. I mean, it's questionable how much real societal value there is and how much employment there is. But yet, now MLG&W has to scramble, TVA has to scramble. You guys probably may even be underestimating what the load growth is based on this sort of huge bubble push. And so at what point do we begin to question whether some tech bro billionaire can come in and completely game the system and force the whole system to respond to their meme machine in their backyard on a get-rich-quick scheme at the expense of the public?
And there's no regulation right now.
There is no regulation right now.
So that is a great point.
Yeah, well beyond my
You're
scope.
okay.
of
I get it, I get it. But this is,
I would love to hear the answer, because when you think about planning a system that needs 20-year investments and something could be gone in 20 days, that is a challenge. It's a challenge. And I'll introduce, and Gabe, feel free to weigh in here, the concepts of Valley Vision, rate changes, structure changes, that I think can help mitigate some of this with regard to what you bring and what you pay need to be commensurate. I think you're highlighting this issue that is potentially bubbling, that it is not the automotive manufacturer that, drops 150 jobs and, $100 million of capital investment and creates a very sort of localized benefit. This is a new construct of, no matter what the AI is doing, whether it's productive or not, where does that go and create the benefit? And then ultimately, who shoulders the costs and the risk burden? And I think that's what we're trying to figure out, or getting prepared.
and it's
to
not
figure
just
out.
you, it's also for KUB and the decision making. I mean, because this is, right now, it is absolutely out of control. Absolutely out of control.
I'll say we're watching that very closely because we're all going to learn. I will tell you historically, this is not the case. I mean, you can't say it applies, but we will guarantee our investments with either funds up front by the customer and or a contract, something that we could make whole because we don't put that risk on our ratepayer. So yes, this is a whole new world. And so it's different. I mean, you've got one of our biggest customers sitting over here, UT and the CMC Steel, they create jobs, create product, make things, run universities, but this is a whole new game because it's I've heard a lot from MLGW about what they're doing, and I'm not going to say fascinated, but I'm quite intrigued by what's going on out there, and it'll be an interesting case study at some point.
Initially, because Musk has the Tesla operation with the megapacks, their storage stuff, and so when it was at 150 megawatts, we were like, this could actually bring some interesting stuff. But when it 10x'd,
Yeah.
If it's really, 10x would be the size of KUB's peak day.
yeah,
I mean, our peak day is about 1350.
yeah.
And so that's hard to comprehend, actually. But I mean, I believe it. I just can't hardly believe how big that is. So.
Yeah.
Can I follow up though on what Steve said? Obviously, there's going to be a huge shift in federal policy when it comes to energy. We're not going to see some of the resources that you mentioned going in some of the same places. And obviously, you did this before the election. So is that kind of baked into that we now have an SEC guy that's going to be in crypto? We're going to have a DOE guy in fracking. What's incentivized, what's not incentivized? How does that play into this?
Yeah, as being a federal entity is a fun
It's tough, isn't
experience
it?
every 4 or so years. But this effort is really designed to be apolitical, right? These are the costs of these things. This is the modeling. This is the results. It'll get interesting in the conversations around what does one administration lean into versus another. Politics aside, I am encouraged by the fact that that there's rhetoric around the fact of energy security. I do think that is an important consideration if what Stephen's describing is going to play out or does play out. What TVA has to do is we have a commitment to serve, but we do have the ability to say by when. And so if we can't build fast enough, we cannot put the rest of the system at risk, right? And that may not be a popular stance, and I can guarantee you it isn't, no matter what the customer type is.
Yeah.
And so these are the interesting tensions and friction point. But largely this effort, the IRP, is setting up those types of conversations and, you know, how quickly loads come versus what drives them, what regulations show up. We're using a cost of carbon. Do I personally think that Congress could pass a carbon tax? I don't. I'm just not sure that could get done, but maybe it will. But we have this in here as a proxy, right? They may choose other pathways to create regulation that forces these same issues. So coverage is the goal, foundation is the goal, and then that way we have something that covers as many bases as we can. And we push the envelope. I mean, those were wide ranges, and I think one of the challenges is when you push the envelope, it's like, well, hell, what are you going to do? Are you doing 4 gigs of solar, or are you doing 20? And we have to be very articulate in the final document, kind of where is that baseline direction, and then this is the range that sits around it.
Thank
I
you.
just got one more comment based on what you said and what Steve said with the billionaires dictating pretty much what they want. What is our role as providers to actually stop it? I mean, because even if the government doesn't back it, you guys have the infrastructure and the millions and billions of dollars it would take for them to have to produce their own. So you're in the driver's seat, and you can regulate with or without the government what people get based on demand for everybody. So is that also in this report?
No, I mean, that piece it's the consideration of reliability. So the lens that we work through is highly reliable at the lowest cost, sort of
I got you.
walking
I got
and
you.
into the next
So
step
you're not
of
getting into the
increasingly
ethics of it.
cleaner. Not as
I got you.
much, not here, but you have to wrestle with each individual issue as it comes sort of under the hood of this, right? Whether it's where you site a generation facility and the implications to that community, that has to be part of this same stakeholder engagement process, but now at a very specific level. You know, large loads that would come to the system, you would have a conversation around when can that be served and how can that be served and what's the implications in the meantime. You know, we can add demand response, have added a lot of demand response, but I talk to peak seasons of summer and winter. You also have to be able to take your assets offline and maintain them so that they're there for peak season. So in the outage seasons, there is a baseline amount of resources that have to be there to maintain reliability in those days and the future days.
TVA just has a few more minutes, so does anybody else have a question?
Just on the big load, you do have the ability to say that will be an interruptible load.
Yes.
We'll beat you, but we can cut you off anytime we need to.
That's right. That's right. And it's a delicate posture because we have existing customers who are on demand response interruptible products, and we pay for that, right? That's like us saying we don't want to build the next natural gas CT. We'd rather pay this industrial customer to bring their load down. That's money back into our community and our region. When it's these newer loads that are showing up, the value proposition is a little bit different. It's like, if you want to be here, we'll serve you and make up your, 2 years from now, but you've got to be on demand response between now and then, and I'm not paying you for that. So that's protecting reliability. And I'm sort of being very sort of each end of the curve, and there's a lot of in between to it, but yes.
Yeah, during your process, and it shows the significant gap between firm power now or base power and where you need to be in the different scenarios. Do y'all have an understanding of what would be firm versus interruptible inside those scenario ranges? And if so, do y'all feel that you're ahead of that power supply issue? And if you feel like you're behind, what levers can you pull to speed up to bridge the gap?
Yeah, so we've, cards on the table, coming out of the pandemic, saw a lot of growth, saw some degradation of assets. We had a reliability event during Winter Storm Elliott, and so We have made significant investment in what we've got. We have been securing new PPAs, particularly for peak seasons. There is a stigma with that. There is this sort of perception of reliance on other people's or other markets. When I say PPAs, these are power purchase agreements where we can point to a generator somewhere else, either in our footprint or outside it, and we have a firm transmission path. That is our asset, even if somebody owns it. It's ours to call on, dispatch. And so we've been able to close kind of the gaps that we've had over the last handful of peak seasons. And then the work we're doing with our LPC partners on new demand response, new energy efficiency programs, partner flexibility, these all come together to create that foundation and then facilitate stepping out of the assets that we're having to spend a lot of money on to maintain because they're becoming less and less reliable, more and more susceptible to regulation, and putting in place new resources that are better, more reliable, more megawatts in total. So kind of all these things are happening in concert. I think we still have some challenges ahead. Over the next 3 to 5 years, depending on how load growth plays out, I think we will continue to need to partner well with our LPC partners to navigate through these next handful of years. But yes.
Good question. I'm not going to go back to that. Where's your workforce availability in your metrics of having them available to make all these adjustments and have them available?
Yeah, it's kind of like that hydrogen economy thing that I mentioned before. It is assumed to be there. We do have a cost curve associated with when you get a lot of volume of construction or resources getting added that we would then contract for. The cost curve goes up to reflect the fact that you may be running out of the skilled craft labor that has to be in place to build this stuff, maintain it, and operate it. And so when you get into these higher load growth scenarios and you get into these higher volumes of resource additions, you get into higher cost portfolios that manifest this issue that will have to be addressed. Otherwise, the costs are, not high enough.
I am going to draw an end to questions because they do have to drive to Bristol and traffic is growing. But on the back of your sheet here, it does tell you how you can submit comment on the IRP, and I'm sure that TVA would welcome any comments that you might have.
Absolutely.
We want to thank Amy and Cliff for spending time with us today. And Christina, we apologize. We flipped our program. We thanked all our retiring board members at the beginning, but we certainly are going to miss you. You've been with us 4 years, and we have appreciated your insights. Our next meeting is February 6th, and it will be back at the original time from 3 to 4:30. The topic is going to be KUB's process for implementing a new customer information system. This system is going to allow them to assist customers in a more efficient way, and they really are going to want you to think about that and give them some input on features that you think would benefit and serve the customers. Any final comments or questions from anyone?
One thing I gotta ask, what is our workforce gonna look like with all this new technology? And what, for the people, those of us who are doing workforce development, what do we really need to be skewing our people to?
I think the emerging technology space is going to be critically important. If we truly are in this path of electrifying everything, the skilled craft piece is going to be very important. Very important. And then the understanding of how to advance some of these things. I mean, I'm in the weeds, so I apologize, but some of the assumptions around the advanced nuclear require that industry evolving and being supported in a way that it can find efficiencies and bring the cost of those resources down. We have that as a baseline assumption that the first SMR you build is significantly more expensive than the sixth. And so to facilitate
we're really looking
that.
at electrical engineering engineers and nuclear engineers, but when we're looking at the craftsmen and those disciplines, that's another conversation because yes,
has to be there. Has to be there. Yep.
Thank you, Kira.
I'll add just thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I know we've got to get on the road and apologize for that, but if you all have questions, please work through the the contacts at KUB, and they'll get those to us, and I'll be happy to respond to them. So thank you again for the time, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So everybody, have a happy holiday, and please grab some cake on your way out.
We're gonna make all the KU